The dust had not even settled on the road when Frederick Slater saw her, and everything he thought he understood about solitude cracked straight down the middle. She came walking up the long dirt path that wound through the dry Colorado grassland toward his ranch house, and the sun was already low and merciless behind her, painting her silhouette in shades of amber and rust. She was carrying something wrapped in a blanket against her chest, clutched with both arms the way a person holds the last thing in the world that belongs to them. She was not on horseback. She had no wagon. She had no escort, no companion, no visible weapon, and no explanation attached to her that he could see from the porch where he stood with a coffee tin going cold in his hand. Frederick set the tin down on the rail. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders from 15 years of ranching work, and not a man who startled easily. He had seen cattle stampedes and drought years, and one particularly ugly winter that had taken 3 of his best horses. He was not a man who ran toward trouble, but he was not a man who ran from it either. He stayed where he was and watched her come. She walked with purpose, he noticed, not with the stumbling gait of someone lost, not with the frantic energy of someone fleeing something immediate. She was tired. That much was plain from 60 yards away. Her steps were measured in the careful way that meant a body was conserving what little it had left, but she had direction. She was walking straight toward his door. It was 1882, and the Colorado Territory had been a state for 6 years, though you would not always know it from the way people still treated the land as if it belonged to the wind and nobody else. Frederick's ranch sat 12 miles southeast of the town of Creston, which was not a large town, but was at least a real one, with a general store and a doctor and a Presbyterian church that held services every Sunday whether there were 10 people in the pews or 40. Frederick made the ride into Creston twice a week for supplies and occasionally for company, though company was something he had learned to manage without when he needed to. He had purchased this land in 1875, with money saved from 5 years of cattle driving work that had taken him from Texas up through Kansas, and eventually left him in Colorado standing in front of a deed office wondering if he was brave enough to stop moving. He had decided he was. The ranch was called Slater's Crossing because of the shallow creek that bent through the eastern pasture, and it ran 430 acres, a reasonable herd of Hereford cattle, 2 working horses, a milk cow named Agnes, and 1 hand named Cormac Reedy, who was 53 years old, deeply religious, and made the best sourdough bread Frederick had ever tasted. Cormac was in the barn when the woman arrived. Frederick was alone on the porch. She stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at him. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement it had started the day in, strands of it clinging to her jaw and her neck. Her dress had once been a pale blue, but the hem was brown with trail dust, and there was a tear along the left sleeve where something sharp had caught it. She had green eyes, and they were absolutely steady in a face that was doing its best to hold composure together by sheer force of will. In her arms, the bundle shifted. A small sound came from within it. Not a cry, not yet, but the preparatory noise of a baby testing its own lungs. Frederick looked at the bundle. He looked at the woman. She said nothing. He stepped down off the porch, and that was when he got close enough to see the full weight of what she was carrying. Not just the infant, but everything behind her eyes, the exhaustion and the fear, and the particular kind of determination that only comes from a person who has already decided they have nothing left to lose, and so has stopped being afraid of what comes next. He looked at the child, who was small, perhaps 6 or 8 weeks old, wrapped in a blanket that was not the same blue as the woman's dress but a faded yellow, as if it had come from somewhere else entirely. He stepped back, not in alarm, not in dismissal. He stepped back to make room, and he said it simply, without ceremony, the way a person says the thing they mean without decoration. "Both of you get inside." She blinked. Something in her face moved, some tightly held thing that had been braced against the possibility of rejection, and it loosened just slightly. She climbed the 2 porch steps and walked through the door he held open, and he followed her in, and the door closed behind them, and that was how it began. Her name was Charlotte Keating. She told him that first, before anything else, sitting in the chair closest to the cold fireplace with the baby balanced on her knees while Frederick moved to build up a fire because the evening was coming in cool. She told him her name, and she said it the way someone says their name when they are reminding themselves who they are, not just informing a stranger. Charlotte Keating, he repeated, touching the name with some care, and then he lit the kindling and turned to look at her. And the child. She looked down at the infant. The baby was awake now, dark-eyed and watchful in the way that very young babies sometimes are, as if they arrived from somewhere that required attention. "Her name is Rose," Charlotte said. "She is not mine. I want you to know that before anything else. I want to be straight with you from the start." Frederick sat down across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "Whose is she?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment, not in the evasive way, but in the way of someone assembling facts into an order that will make sense when delivered. "Her mother was my friend," she said finally. "Was. Her name was Irene Beale. We grew up in the same town in Missouri, Harlow's Creek, which isn't much of a town, but it was the one we had. Irene married a man named Douglas Beale when she was 19, and he was considerably older, and she followed him out here to Colorado 2 years ago because he had land claims he said were going to make them both rich." "Did they?" Frederick asked. "No," Charlotte said. "He had debts he had not told her about, and the land claims were mostly promises with very little behind them. He drank. Not mean, not violent, just absent. Irene wrote me letters. I still have them." She shifted Rose to her other arm with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for weeks. 8 weeks ago, Irene had Rose. There were complications. She did not survive them. The fire had caught now, and the room was warming. Frederick did not look away from Charlotte's face. "And Douglas Beale, he left." The 2 words carried something in them that was not quite bitterness and not quite grief, but something in between. "The day after Irene died, he rode out and did not come back. Left Rose with a neighbor woman, a Mrs. Caldwell, who had 4 children of her own and could not manage a 5th. Mrs. Caldwell wrote to me in Harlow's Creek because she found my letters in Irene's things and she did not know what else to do." "So you came," Frederick said. "I came," Charlotte said. "I took every dollar I had, which was $43 and some coins, and I took the train from Harlow's Creek to Denver and then the stage to Creston. And then I was told that Mrs. Caldwell's homestead was another 8 miles east, and I was told there was a ranch along the way, and I thought." She stopped. She looked at him with those steady green eyes. "I thought I would ask for help finding the road. I have not eaten since this morning, and Rose needs feeding. I have a tin of condensed milk in this bag." She nodded toward a canvas bag that hung from her shoulder, which he had not looked at closely because the baby had held all of his attention. He stood up immediately. "You should have said that straight away," he said, moving toward the kitchen. "I'll get you food and water, and there's milk from my cow that's better for the child than the tin." "Thank you," Charlotte said, and those 2 words had more gratitude packed into them than most speeches. Frederick spent the next quarter hour moving through the kitchen with efficiency that surprised even him. He had lived alone on this ranch for 4 years before that. A brief and unsuccessful marriage to a woman named Helen, who had decided 18 months in that the ranch was too isolated, and the work too hard, and had returned to her family in Denver with a civil goodbye and no remaining affection. He was not practiced at hospitality, but his hands knew what to do. Heat the leftover stew from lunch, cut bread, fill a glass with water, warm milk for the baby in a small pan. When he brought everything to the table and Charlotte settled Rose into the crook of one arm and used her free hand to eat, he watched her the way you watch someone who is doing 3 things at once and doing all of them competently, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was simple, uncomplicated admiration. Cormac came in from the barn while she was eating, stomped the dust from his boots at the door, and stopped dead when he saw the woman and the baby at the table. "Lord have mercy," Cormac said, which was his response to most unexpected things. "Cormac, this is Charlotte Keating," Frederick said. "She is on her way to the Caldwell homestead east of here. She'll stay the night." Cormac looked at the baby. He looked at Frederick. He looked at Charlotte. He pulled off his hat and held it to his chest. "Ma'am, welcome. That is a fine-looking child." "Thank you," Charlotte said. "Her name is Rose." "Rose," Cormac said, nodding as if filing the name away in a place of importance. "I will make up the spare room." He glanced at Frederick again, with an expression that Frederick chose to ignore, because Cormac had a way of communicating entire editorial opinions through the subtle arrangement of his eyebrows, and Frederick was not in the mood to receive them. The spare room was the one that had been a storage room until Helen had cleared it out and made it livable, and after Helen left, Frederick had put the storage back. But Cormac cleared it again in 15 minutes, found clean linens, and produced from somewhere a small wooden crate that, padded with a folded blanket, made a serviceable bed for an infant. He left it outside the door without ceremony and went back to his own small room at the back of the house. Charlotte ate until the bowl was empty. She drank 2 glasses of water. She fed Rose with the warmed milk using the small rubber-tipped bottle she had apparently been carrying in that canvas bag, and Rose took it without objection. And then Rose slept. Charlotte sat at the table with the sleeping infant in her arms, and the firelight moved across her face, and Frederick sat across from her with his cold coffee finally replaced by something hot, and they talked. This was the part that surprised him most later, when he thought back on it. Not the arrival, not the strangeness of the situation, but the talking. He had not talked like that in a long time. Not the practical commerce of conversation about cattle prices and weather and fence repairs that made up most of his human interaction, but actual talking, the kind where you follow one thought to the next and arrive somewhere you did not expect. She told him about Harlow's Creek, Missouri, about growing up the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Charlotte was 12, leaving her to raise her 2 younger brothers alongside her father. She told him about how she had learned to sew and to cook, and to manage a household not because anyone decided those were her proper occupations, but because the work needed doing, and she was the one present to do it. She told him about Irene, how they had been best friends since they were 7 years old, how Irene had laughed too loudly at everything funny, and had been absolutely terrible at mathematics, and had made the most extraordinary apple preserves. Frederick told her about Texas, about the cattle drives, about the specific quality of loneliness that comes from sleeping under open sky with 20 other men, and never once feeling less alone. He told her about buying the land, about the first winter, about Agnes the milk cow who had a personality, he claimed, of considerable opinions. Charlotte laughed at that. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and it changed the shape of her face entirely, and Frederick felt the change of it land somewhere in his chest like a warm stone dropping into still water. "What will you do?" he asked her eventually, when the fire had burned lower and the night outside the window had gone fully dark. "When you reach Mrs. Caldwell, what then?" "I will take Rose," Charlotte said without hesitation, "back to Harlow's Creek to my father. He will help me." A small pause. "I think." "You think?" "He is a good man," she said carefully, "but he is a practical man, and I am 27 years old and unmarried, and arriving home with another woman's infant is not a simple thing to explain." "No," Frederick agreed, "it is not. But she is Irene's daughter," Charlotte said, and her voice had that quality again, that absolute steadiness over something that was clearly moving underneath. "Irene had no other family that would claim her. Douglas Beale's family is back in Missouri too, and I would not trust them with a garden, let alone a child. Rose has nobody in the world except me. And I am what I am, which is a woman with $43 and a canvas bag and no plan past getting her to safety. But she has me, and I intend to keep that so." Frederick looked at her across the table in the firelight and said nothing for a moment, because he was thinking about what it must have taken to get on a train with $43 and a destination and a resolve that clearly had no backup plan. And he found that he had nothing to say to it except something that would have embarrassed him, so he said instead, "You can stay as long as you need to. The room is there." She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. "You don't know me." "No," he said. "But I know enough." She stayed 3 days. The first morning, Frederick rode into Creston to get supplies condensed milk, which was a sensible precaution, and a few other things that a woman with an infant might need. Things he had no idea about but that Mrs. Horton at the general store supplied him with efficiently and without too many questions, though her eyes held about 40 of them in reserve. He also posted a letter to the Caldwell homestead on Charlotte's behalf, informing them of a slight delay. When he returned to the ranch, Charlotte was in the kitchen with Cormac, and she was teaching him to make a proper gravy because she had apparently determined over breakfast that the gravy Cormac produced was thin and flavorless, which Cormac was receiving with more grace than Frederick would have expected, probably because Cormac was constitutionally incapable of resisting the company of capable women. Rose was in the crate in the kitchen corner, awake and quiet, watching the ceiling with the focused concentration of an individual who has recently discovered that ceilings exist and finds them very interesting. Frederick stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and watched Charlotte stir the pan, her hair braided properly now and her dress the same one but clean, because she had washed it the night before and it had dried by morning. She had found an apron somewhere, his apron, the one that hung on the hook by the stove, and she was wearing it without self-consciousness, and she was explaining to Cormac about fond, about the drippings left in the pan after meat, about building flavor from the bottom up. "You have to respect what's already there," she was saying. "The flavor doesn't come from adding things, it comes from not wasting what you have." "Amen," Cormac said, with the sincerity of a man who was agreeing both literally and theologically. Charlotte looked up and saw Frederick in the doorway, and something in her expression shifted, not alarm, not exactly, but awareness, the kind of awareness that travels between two people who have been honest with each other in firelight and are now navigating daylight. "You're back," she said. "I am," he said, and carried the supplies to the table. That afternoon he showed her the ranch. He was not sure why, she had not asked, and she was leaving in a day or two, and there was no practical reason to give her a tour. But she had come outside to walk Rose in the cool air, and he had come out to check the east fence, and somehow they had walked together along the creek path while Rose slept bundled against Charlotte's chest, and he had found himself talking about the land with a specificity and affection that he rarely allowed in conversation. He showed her where the creek bent and made a small pool that was good for fishing. He showed her the field where the Herefords grazed, the animals heavy and russet-colored, moving slowly through the late September grass. He showed her the barn where his 2 horses, a bay named Captain and a gray named Sunday, turned their heads with polite interest. "Do you ride?" he asked. "Poorly," she said, "but I ride." "Missouri doesn't make riders," he said, not unkindly. "Missouri makes everything else," she replied, with a small smile that he was already learning to look for. They stood at the fence of the near pasture, and the afternoon light was the particular gold that Colorado makes in late September, the kind of light that makes everything look as if it has been there forever and will be there always. And Charlotte looked out at the cattle and the grass and the blue sky and said quietly, "It is very beautiful here." "It is," Frederick said. "Most days I forget to notice." She looked at him. "You should not forget." "No," he said, "I shouldn't." That was the moment, if he were honest with himself later, when he understood that he did not want her to leave. Not as an idea, not as a generosity, she was welcome to stay. He had already said so, but as a fact that sat in him with weight, a stone of wanting that he had not felt since before Helen left, and maybe not even then, because with Helen the wanting had always been mixed with uncertainty, whereas this was clear and simple, and for precisely that reason terrifying. He said nothing about it. She was leaving. She had Rose and a plan and $43 and a destination. He was a rancher who had been alone long enough to have made a comfortable shape of it. There was nothing to say. On the second evening, Cormac made supper, and then made himself scarce with the sensitivity of a man who had lived long enough to recognize a situation. And Frederick and Charlotte sat at the table again, and Rose slept in her crate by the fire, and the conversation moved differently this time, slower and more careful, because both of them were aware of what was underneath it now. "Tell me about your marriage," Charlotte said, not invasively, not prying, but the way you ask a question when you want to understand someone better. Frederick turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Helen was a good woman," he said. "She was. She came from Denver and she had ideas about what a rancher's wife's life would be, and those ideas and the reality, they did not match. She told me clearly when she left. She said she was not suited for isolation and she would not pretend otherwise. I respected that." "Were you in love with her?" Charlotte asked. He considered this genuinely. "I was fond of her," he said. "I wanted it to work. I don't think what I felt for Helen was, I don't think it was the kind of love that changes you. I think we were both practical and we thought practicality was enough." He paused. "It wasn't," Charlotte nodded slowly. "I was engaged once," she said, "in Harlow's Creek. A man named Philip Connor, who was a banker's son and very presentable, and my father approved of him enormously." "What happened?" "He moved to St. Louis," she said. "He had opportunities there. He asked me to come and I said I needed to stay. My father was not well that year and my youngest brother was 15 and still in school, and he said he understood and he left. And after a year the letters stopped, and then I heard from someone that he had married a woman in St. Louis." A small pause. "I was more embarrassed than heartbroken, I think, which told me something about how deep it had actually been." "What did it tell you?" Frederick asked. "I had been choosing the sensible thing rather than the true thing," she said. "And I think I have been doing that for a long time, choosing what is sensible." She looked at Rose in the crate, at the sleeping face, the small curled fists. "Coming here for Rose was the first entirely nonsensible thing I have done in years. My father will not consider it sensible. My brothers will not consider it sensible. No one will consider it sensible." "I consider it sensible," Frederick said. She looked at him. "If sensible means doing the thing that is right," he said, "then coming for her was the most sensible thing you could have done. Not everything that is right is easy or convenient, but that doesn't make it less sensible." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, and something in her face was very still in the way that things are still just before they move. "You are a surprising man, Frederick Slater," she said. "Am I?" he said. "You are," she said. "Most men would have turned me away at the door. No explanation, another woman's baby, looking like I'd walked from Denver." "You looked like someone who needed a door opened," he said. That seemed reason enough. The third morning arrived with a problem. Rose, who had been quiet and taking milk adequately since her arrival, woke at 4 in the morning with a fever. Charlotte came to Frederick's door and knocked, and he was up in 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to go from fully asleep to standing, a habit built by years of ranch emergencies. Charlotte stood in the dark hall with Rose in her arms, and Rose's face was flushed, and she was crying in the high, thin way that meant discomfort rather than immediate danger, but Charlotte's face was tight with fear. "She is warm," Charlotte said. "Her forehead is very warm." Frederick dressed quickly and saddled Captain by lantern light, and rode 12 miles into Creston at a pace that was hard on the horse and hard on the night, and returned with Dr. Ezra Marsh sitting behind him, a weathered man of 60 who smelled of pipe tobacco and had been delivering babies and treating fevers in this county for 20 years. Dr. Marsh examined Rose in the kitchen while Frederick stood in the doorway, and Charlotte stood beside the table, still in her nightgown with a shawl over her shoulders, her hair down, holding Rose's hand between 2 fingers. "Mild respiratory irritation," Dr. Marsh said, with the calm authority of someone who has seen everything and calibrates concern precisely. "Not uncommon in young infants. Keep her warm, continue feeding her, add a drop of eucalyptus to warm water and let her breathe the steam." He looked at Charlotte. "She will be fine, Mrs. Slater." A brief silence. "Miss Keating," Charlotte said quietly. Dr. Marsh glanced between her and Frederick and then glanced at Rose, and then at the kitchen they were standing in, and arrived at some private conclusion that he kept entirely to himself. "Miss Keating," he corrected pleasantly, "the child will recover. I'd keep her still and warm for 2 days." He left with a professional courtesy and a fee of $1, which Frederick paid, and which Charlotte immediately tried to reimburse from her canvas bag, and which Frederick waved away with a firmness that ended the discussion. 2 days became 4 days. The fever broke on the 2nd day, as Dr. Marsh had promised, but the rain that started the 3rd day turned the road to Caldwell's homestead into something that was not really a road any more so much as a suggestion between 2 stretches of mud. Charlotte stayed. She had no reasonable choice. And something happened in those extra days that both of them were careful not to name, the way you are careful around a small fire you are not sure you want to grow. She helped around the house in ways that were not intrusive, but that made the house feel different, cleaner, warmer, more intentional. She found a pattern for mending in her canvas bag and repaired the torn curtain in the front room that Frederick had been meaning to see to for approximately 2 years. She reorganized the kitchen shelves in a way that Cormac endorsed enthusiastically, and Frederick found he could immediately locate things that had previously spent days being not where he expected them. She also talked to him in the evenings. That was the thing that held the most weight, the talking. She was direct without being harsh, thoughtful without being slow, and she laughed more easily as the days passed, as if the exhaustion and fear of her arrival were lifting layer by layer with each meal and each night of sleep. She had opinions about things, about the proper management of grazing land, which she had apparently absorbed through her father's practical education, about the political situation in the Colorado Territory, about the absurdity of the corset as a garment of daily use, which she said with such calm authority that Frederick laughed out loud and she looked pleased. He admitted to himself on the 4th evening, falling completely and without reserve into something he had not expected. He was falling for Charlotte Keating, who had arrived carrying another woman's baby and no explanation, and who had, in the space of 4 days, made his house feel more like a home than it had in 7 years. He said none of this. She was leaving. She had a plan. He was a man who respected other people's plans. On the 5th morning, the road was passable. Charlotte came downstairs with her canvas bag packed and Rose in her arms, and Frederick was saddling Sunday because he was going to take her to the Caldwell homestead himself, because that much he could do. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of Colorado fall morning that looks like a painting. Cormac was standing at the barn door with his hat in his hands, and he said goodbye to Charlotte with evident emotion and told Rose that she was welcome back any time, directing this to Rose's face as if a 6-week-old infant could fully process the invitation. Charlotte stood with Sunday's reins in one hand and Rose in the other arm, and she looked at Frederick and he looked at her, and there was that silence again, the one that held more than both of them were saying. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said. "You don't need to," he said. "I do," she said. "You opened the door when you had no reason to. You rode in the dark for a doctor. You made room for us when there was no practical reason to make room." "There was a reason," he said quietly. She held his gaze for a moment. "What reason?" He took a breath. He was not a man who spoke easily about what he felt, but he was also not a coward, and whatever the next minutes held, he did not intend to let her leave without saying the thing that was true. "Because you mattered," he said. "From the moment you came up that road, both of you mattered." Charlotte was very still. The morning air moved around them and the horses stood patient, and Cormac had apparently found something enormously interesting to study on the barn roof. "Frederick," she said, "I'm not asking you to stay," he said quickly. "I know you have to go to Caldwell's, and I know you have your father and your brothers and your life in Missouri. I am not making this difficult. I only wanted you to know it, because you deserve to know it." She looked at him with those green eyes that had been steady from the first step up his porch, and she said, "I want to write to you. When I am in Harlow's Creek, I want to write to you and I want you to write back. Is that," she stopped, "is that something you want?" "Yes," he said without a pause. "Then we will write," she said, and she handed him Rose while she mounted Sunday, and the transfer of the infant was brief and natural, and when she reached down to take Rose back from him, their hands met around the baby and neither of them let go immediately. "Take care of the road," he said. "Take care of the cattle," she said. He watched them until the bend in the path hid them from view, and then he stood in the yard for another minute and Cormac came and stood beside him. "Well," Cormac said. "Don't," Frederick said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Cormac said, with the tone of a man who was absolutely going to say something. "I was only going to observe that for a man who just let the best thing to walk up his road in living memory ride away from him, you look remarkably calm." "She'll write," Frederick said. "Will she?" Cormac said. "She will," Frederick said. "She did." The first letter arrived 11 days later, which was quick given the distance, and the writing on the envelope was clear and deliberate. Charlotte Keating spelled out in her return address, as if she wanted there to be no ambiguity about who it was from. She wrote about the Caldwell homestead, which had been exactly as advertised, struggling, stretched thin. Mrs. Caldwell, a kind and exhausted woman who had wept with relief when Charlotte arrived and wept again when Charlotte left with Rose. She wrote about the stage ride back to Denver and the train east to Missouri, about Rose sleeping through most of it with magnificent indifference to the motion. She wrote about arriving in Harlow's Creek and walking into her father's house and placing Rose on the kitchen table and saying, "Papa, I need to explain something." Her father, Thomas Keating, 61 years old and a man of schoolteacher precision, had listened to the full explanation. He had sat across from his daughter in the kitchen he had run for 30 years, and he had looked at Rose and he had said, finally, "She looks like Irene." "She does," Charlotte had said. "Then she stays," Thomas Keating had said, with the decisive simplicity of a man who understood that some things are not complicated if you choose not to make them complicated. Charlotte wrote this to Frederick and then wrote, "I thought of you when he said that, because it reminded me of how you said, both of you, get inside. That same certainty, I think my father and you would understand each other." Frederick read that sentence 4 times. He wrote back. He wrote about the ranch, about the fall roundup, about the first frost that had come 2 nights ago and taken the last of the late grass. He wrote about Cormac, who had apparently continued improving his gravy situation and was now producing something genuinely excellent. He wrote about Captain and Sunday and Agnes the opinionated milk cow. He wrote about walking along the creek at evening and finding himself thinking about what she had said, "You should not forget to notice how beautiful it is," and how he had been noticing it more. He almost wrote more than that. He almost wrote things that he folded back up and did not include, but he wrote at the end, "I would like to see you again. If that is something you want, I would like it very much." Her reply came 2 weeks later, and she had written the same thing almost verbatim, and that was enough for both of them to understand that something was in motion between them that was larger than letters. The correspondence continued through October and into November, and by November the letters were longer and more frequent, arriving twice a week on each end, and each one went further toward the center of things, further toward the honest territory that 2 people find when they have been writing to each other long enough to lose the careful performance of correspondence. She told him that Rose was thriving, growing visibly, developing a habit of grabbing whatever was nearest to her small hands with startling conviction. She told him about the sounds Rose made, the way she had started to smile, real smiles, not the reflex kind, and how the first time Rose had smiled at her Charlotte had had to sit down because her knees had simply gone. "I did not know," Charlotte wrote. "I did not know that loving someone you are responsible for is this specific kind of thing. It is not like loving a friend or a parent, or even, it is not like loving a person you choose. You do not choose this, it simply is, and it is enormous." He read that letter 3 times and then wrote back, "I think you know exactly what kind of love is the most important. I think you have always known that. I think that is why you came." She wrote in December, My father has asked me several times about the rancher in Colorado. I have told him very little, and somehow he has surmised a great deal. He is a school teacher. He is accustomed to reading what is not explicitly said. Frederick wrote back. What has he surmised? She wrote that I am not thinking about coming home to Missouri to stay. Frederick read that and put the letter down and stood at the window of his front room looking out at the December range, the dry grass and the far mountains with their snow, and he felt something move through him like a warm current in cold water. He sat down and wrote the longest letter he had ever written in his life. He wrote about the ranch and what it required and what it offered. He wrote about the isolation honestly, because she deserved honesty and not a sales pitch. He wrote about the winters, which were hard, and the springs, which were beautiful, and the summers, which were hot and long and full of work. He wrote about the house, which was good-sized and solid and had a room that would be fine for Rose and another that could be made fine for whatever else the future held. He wrote about Cormac, who was part of the ranch the way the creek was part of the ranch, and who would be an excellent influence on a child and who made very good bread. And then he wrote, I am not asking you to come without knowing what you would be coming to. I am telling you everything I can so that if you come with full knowledge. And if you come with full knowledge, I want you to come because you want to be here, not because it is sensible, because it is the true thing. He signed it, Frederick Slater, who is thinking about you every day and has been since October. Her reply came on the 3rd of January, 1883. It said, I will come in March, when the roads are passable if you still want us. He wrote back by return post, I will want you both on every day of the remainder of my life. Come in March. I will be at the door. He also, because he was not a man who left things to chance, and had decided to stop being cautious about the things that mattered, rode into Creston the following week, and had a conversation with Reverend Miles at the Presbyterian Church, which was a brief and practical conversation. And then he rode to Denver on the weekend following, and entered a jeweler's shop on Larimer Street that had been there since the 1860s, and he spent considerably more than he had planned to. But he came out with something in his breast pocket that made the cold ride home feel entirely warm. March in Colorado was unpredictable, as Colorado in any month is unpredictable, but the 3rd week of March arrived with weather that was almost cool but clear, the kind of days that smell like beginning. Frederick had been up since 5 that morning. He had told himself this was because there was work to do, and there was, but Cormac had found him pacing the front porch at 6 with his coffee going cold again, and Cormac had said nothing, only shaken his head with a slow satisfaction that said everything. The stage from Creston was due at the crossroads 4 miles west at midday. Frederick had Agnes tied in the small paddock and both horses brushed, and his own boots actually polished, which Cormac had observed and stored away for future reference as the clearest indicator he had ever witnessed of a man thoroughly undone by love. He hitched the buckboard and drove out to meet the stage. She was the second person off the step, and she had Rose on her hip and the canvas bag on her other shoulder, and she was wearing a dark green dress that he had not seen before, and her hair was properly pinned, and she looked like every letter she had written distilled into a person. And when she saw him standing by the buckboard, she stopped for a moment on the step of the stage and looked at him with those green eyes, and then she smiled, and it was the smile that changed the shape of her face, the real one. And he was ruined. Frederick, she said. Charlotte, he said. He crossed the distance in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, and he took her free hand in both of his, and Rose, between them, grabbed his coat lapel with proprietary authority, and he laughed and Charlotte laughed, and the stage driver looked bored, and Cormac, who had allegedly stayed at the ranch but had in fact driven behind at a respectful distance, and was now parked 20 yards back with excellent hearing, felt something in his chest that he identified as the presence of God. They drove back to the ranch in the buckboard, Charlotte beside him with Rose on her lap, and the Colorado landscape opened around them in the early spring light, gold and blue and immense, and Frederick talked, and Charlotte talked and Rose contributed her own commentary in the particular vocal register she had developed since October. "She is so much bigger," Frederick said, looking at Rose. "She is very determined about it," Charlotte said. "She grows as if she has decided to, and nothing will stand in her way." He looked at Charlotte. "Sounds familiar." She looked at him sideways, and there was warmth in it. "I was not always this way," she said. "I was, as I told you, very fond of the sensible choice." "You are the most sensible person I know," he said. "You are also the bravest. I don't think those things are actually opposites." She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was soft and certain at the same time. "You said that before, in a letter, one of the early ones." "I meant it," he said. "I still do." When they arrived at the ranch, Cormac had done something to the front of the house that involved sweeping the porch and putting Agnes's water bucket somewhere less prominent and making the entrance look, Frederick admitted, considerably better than usual. Cormac was standing on the porch with his hat in his hand and his Sunday expression on his face, which he reserved for church and significant occasions. "Welcome back, Miss Keating," Cormac said, "and welcome, Miss Rose." "It is good to be back, Mr. Rady," Charlotte said, and she meant it, and the house seemed to receive the meaning, the way old houses do when they have been waiting. She spent 3 days settling in her things in the spare room, Rose's things arranged as well, the small wooden crate that had been Rose's first bed still there, though Rose had grown past it and now slept in a proper small cradle that Frederick had built in February from ash wood, which he had done very carefully with plans borrowed from a book and the help of Cormac's steady hands. Charlotte had seen the cradle and said nothing for a moment, and then she had said, "You built this." "I did," he said. "For Rose," she said. "I built it in February," he said. "I thought she might need it." Charlotte had put her hand on the side of the cradle and looked at it, and her expression was the one that people have when they are moved but do not want to cry, the careful, contained expression. "Thank you," she said, with the same weight as the first time, that two-word sentence carrying more than most speeches. On the 4th evening, after Rose was asleep in the cradle and Cormac had gone to his room, and the fire was built, and the house was quiet, Frederick asked Charlotte to walk with him on the porch. The evening was cold, but not bitterly so, and the stars over Colorado in March are extraordinary, the kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very lucky. They stood at the porch rail, not quite touching, and he could feel her beside him in the dark, the warmth of her and the particular way she was quiet, which was an engaged quiet, a listening quiet. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said. He turned to face her. She turned toward him. In the starlight her face was clear and her eyes were on his with that steadiness that he had never gotten used to, that direct looking that said she was entirely present. "I told you in my letter that I will want both of you on every day of the remainder of my life," he said. "I meant that. I mean it right now, standing here. I am not a complicated man. I'm a rancher in Colorado who is very fortunate to have someone walk up his road, and I have spent the past 6 months being aware that I am the luckiest man I know." He reached into his breast pocket. "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am asking you knowing the full truth of who you are, and I am asking because the full truth of who you are is exactly why I am asking. I am asking because you are the truest thing I have come across in a long time." He opened the small box. Inside it, on a scrap of velvet, was a ring with a small round stone set simply in silver. Not extravagant, not flashy, but clear and good and solid, the way the land was solid. Charlotte looked at the ring and then looked at him. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Will you and Rose stay? Will you let this be home?" She was quiet for a long moment. He waited because she had earned the right to her moment and he was not a man who couldn't be still. "Yes," she said finally, and the word was very simple and very certain. "Yes to all of it. Yes." He took her hand and put the ring on her finger and it fit, which he had measured for with great anxiety from a ring Helen had left behind in a drawer. And when it settled on Charlotte's finger she looked at it and then looked at him and then, because neither of them had anything more useful to say, he closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was the first time, and it was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that comes from 6 months of letters and fireside conversations, and the restrained wanting of two people who have been careful, because they did not want to mistake the thing. And when it is finally allowed, it is not restrained at all. She kissed him back with both hands on his face, and the stars were above them, and the ranch spread out around them in the dark. And inside the house Rose slept peacefully in her cradle, and Cormac, in his room at the back, heard nothing and assumed nothing, and possibly said a quiet prayer. They were married in Creston on the last Saturday of April 1883, in the Presbyterian church where Reverend Miles had been expecting them since January. The church had 32 people in it, because Creston was not a large town, but was a community that showed up for its own. Thomas Keating had come from Harlow's Creek for it, taking the train and the stage with the particular combination of dignity and emotion that characterizes fathers at their daughters' weddings. He had met Frederick the evening before over supper, and the two men had talked for 3 hours, and Thomas Keating had said to his daughter afterward, with the precision of a schoolteacher who chooses his words, "He is a good man, a genuinely good man. There is a difference." Charlotte had said, "I know." Rose was 4 months old at the wedding and wore a small white dress that Charlotte had made from an old petticoat, and she sat in Cormac's arms through the entire ceremony, because Cormac had offered and Charlotte had accepted, and Cormac held Rose with the gravity of a man entrusted with something precious and irreplaceable, which he understood her to be. When Reverend Miles asked if anyone had objections, no one said anything, because there was nothing to object to, and then Frederick and Charlotte exchanged their vows in the plain and honest manner of two people who understand exactly what they are promising. Frederick's voice was steady. Charlotte's was steady. Neither of them looked away from the other. When it was done, Reverend Miles said, "Mr. and Mrs. Slater," and the church made its sound of approval, and Thomas Keating in the front pew pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose in the discreet way of a man who is not accustomed to weeping in public. After the wedding, there was a celebration at the Creston Meeting Hall that lasted into the evening, with food brought by half the town and a fiddle player named Joseph Carver, who had a repertoire of approximately 12 songs, but played all of them very well. Frederick danced with Charlotte twice and discovered that she was a considerably better dancer than he was, which she handled with diplomatic grace. She danced with her father and with Cormac, and she accepted congratulations from people. She was only just meeting with the warmth and directness that Frederick had known since the first evening at his table. Tom Greeley, the man who ran the livery stable and who Frederick had known for 6 years, pulled him aside at one point and said with evident approval, "She's a fine woman, Fred. Where'd you find her?" "She walked up my road," Frederick said. Tom Greeley looked at him. "Just walked up your road." "With a baby and no explanation," Frederick said. Tom Greeley shook his head slowly. "Lord works in interesting ways," he said. "He does," Frederick said, and went back to his wife. The summer of 1883 was the good kind, long and warm and busy. The cattle were healthy, the grass was good, and the creek ran well through July. Charlotte settled into the ranch with the same competent efficiency she had shown in those first strange days of her arrival, but now it was permanence, not courtesy, and the difference showed in everything. She took on the garden that Frederick had maintained in a haphazard fashion that produced occasional vegetables when it felt like it. By midsummer it was producing with purpose, beans and squash and tomatoes, and a row of herbs that Cormac adopted with open joy. She reorganized the household accounts, which Frederick had managed adequately but not elegantly, and found 3 places where he had been overpaying suppliers for years. She repaired things without mentioning that they needed repairing, the kind of competence that manifests as problems simply not existing anymore. But more than any of this, she was present. That was what he found himself thinking about in the evening sometimes, sitting on the porch with her beside him and Rose in her lap, or crawling on the porch boards with the focused determination she brought to everything. Charlotte was present in a way that made everything around her more real. She noticed things. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. She cared about the cattle not as abstractions but as individual animals, and she learned their names and their personalities with the same focus she brought to everything else. Rose grew. She grew with the same determination she had apparently always had, and by 6 months she was pulling herself upright on every available surface, and by 8 months she had taken her first experimental steps between the kitchen table and the counter, while Charlotte stood 6 feet away with her arms out, and Frederick watched from the doorway with his heart in his throat. Rose made the distance. She arrived in Charlotte's arms and looked enormously pleased with herself, and Charlotte looked up at Frederick and her face was incandescent, and he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around both of them right there, and they stood in the kitchen in the morning light, the three of them together, and it was the simplest and most complete thing he had ever been part of. He had begun, by this point, the legal process of adoption for Rose, which was not a simple process in 1883 and required documentation and correspondence and a trip to Denver to speak with a judge. And the process moved slowly because everything legal moved slowly, but it moved. He had also written a letter to Douglas Beale, who had been located by a private inquiry through the county, apparently living in New Mexico, working a mining claim, and the letter had been formal and clear, stating Frederick's intention to adopt the child and requesting a legal relinquishment. Douglas Beale's reply had arrived 3 weeks later, 2 sentences in a cramped hand that said he had no objection and considered the matter concluded. Frederick had felt no particular emotion about this response. He had filed it with the other paperwork and continued. On a warm evening in August, Charlotte found him on the porch with a book he was not reading and sat down beside him with Rose drowsing in her arms and said, "I want to tell you something." He put the book down. "I think I am going to have a baby," she said, calm, steady, but with something in her face that was entirely new, a kind of luminous uncertainty, the look of someone standing at a door they have not opened before. "I am not certain, but I think so." Frederick was very still for a moment, and then something in him moved so completely that he didn't trust his voice, and so he reached out and took her free hand, the one that wasn't holding Rose, and held it. Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. I feel extraordinary, actually, which I understand is not always the case at the beginning, but right now I feel," she stopped. "I feel like everything is happening exactly as it should." He looked at her. The summer evening was around them, the light long and golden, the ranch spreading out in all directions, solid and alive. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am so glad you came up that road," he said. She laughed, the real one, the one that changed her face. "I am so glad you opened the door," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her temple, and Rose stirred in her arms, and the three of them sat on the porch of their home in the Colorado evening, until the stars came out one by one. Dr. Marsh confirmed the pregnancy in September, with the equanimity of a man who has seen many things and views new life as one of the better ones. He congratulated Frederick with a firm handshake and Charlotte with a genuine smile, and said the child would arrive in late spring, which seemed to him like the best time for arrivals. Charlotte wrote to her father and to her brothers, and the replies came full of warmth and celebration. Thomas Keating wrote a long letter of which the central message was, "This is as it should be. You found your true thing, Charlotte. Your mother would have been very proud." Charlotte read that letter to Frederick after supper, and he listened, and when she was done he said, "She would have been proud of you before you found me too. She would have been proud of you when you got on that train." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "Where did you come from?" she said softly, not as a question. "Texas," he said. "Originally." She threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it, and they were both laughing, and Rose in her chair banged her spoon on the table in appreciation. The fall of 1883 passed in the particular richness of a life that is full. The roundup went well. The cattle drove to market at good prices. The weather held late into October. Cormac celebrated his 54th birthday with a supper that Charlotte cooked, and during which he was visibly moved in the way that lonely people are moved when they are surrounded by something that feels like family, which it was. Frederick filed the completed adoption papers in Denver in November, and was told the final approval would come in the new year. He rode home in the cold with the paperwork in his saddlebag and the certainty, already existing in everything that mattered, that Rose was his daughter in every way that was real before any court had put its stamp on it. In December, a letter arrived from Harlow's Creek that was not from Thomas Keating but from Charlotte's younger brother William, who was 19 and apparently at a crossroads of his own. He had finished school and was uncertain what came next and was asking, with careful casualness that Charlotte saw through immediately, whether there might be work on a Colorado ranch. She showed the letter to Frederick without commentary. He read it. He looked up. "How is he with horses?" Frederick asked. "He is very good with horses," Charlotte said. "Better than I am." "Tell him to come in March," Frederick said. "When the roads are passable." Charlotte smiled, and there was something in the smile that was layered relief and gratitude and the private satisfaction of a woman who knows that her family is going to be all right. "You and your March arrivals," she said. "March is a good month," he said. William Keating arrived the third week of March 1884, on the stage from Creston, and turned out to be a tall, easy-natured young man with his sister's green eyes and a quick laugh, and a genuine gift with animals that revealed itself within 3 days. Cormac took him under his wing with the enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting for someone to teach, and Frederick gave him honest work and honest pay, and the kind of steady confidence that young men need from the older ones around them. Charlotte watched her brother settle into the ranch with the same quiet satisfaction with which she had watched everything around her grow and root. She was, by April, visibly expecting, and she moved through the work of the ranch and the house with the same competence but with Frederick now keeping a careful eye from reasonable distances, not hovering, which she would not have tolerated, but present and attentive. Dr. Marsh came out in May for a preliminary visit and pronounced everything proceeding well. Charlotte was healthy and Rose was thriving, and the ranch was producing well. And as Cormac said one evening with simple accuracy, "The Lord has been particularly generous with this particular corner of Colorado." The baby arrived on the 14th of June, 1884, in the early morning, with Dr. Marsh present and Cormac outside on the porch with William doing the particular activity of men who are not needed but cannot be anywhere else, which is to say sitting very still and listening to the sounds of the house. Frederick was inside. He had not been asked to leave, and he had not been inclined to go. He sat in the chair near the bed and held Charlotte's hand when she needed it held and stayed out of Dr. Marsh's way when that was what was needed. And he thought about everything that had happened in 2 years, the road and the door and the firelight and the letters and the ring and the church, and all the ordinary extraordinary days in between. The baby cried with a full-bodied authority that announced himself clearly. "A boy," Dr. Marsh said, with satisfaction. Charlotte turned her face to Frederick, and she was exhausted and shining and present in the way that she was always present, and she said, "A boy." "A boy," Frederick said. He was holding her hand and her hand was holding his, and the baby was being wrapped in a cloth by Dr. Marsh, and the morning light was coming through the window, and he was, he thought, happier than he had ever known a person could be. They named him James, Thomas Slater James, for no particular reason, except that it sounded right, and Thomas for Charlotte's father, who received the news by letter 2 weeks later, and was reported by Charlotte's brother to have read the letter 3 times before putting it down and saying nothing at all, which Thomas Keating's children understood to be his version of enormous joy. Rose, 16 months old and of decided opinions about everything, inspected her brother with the serious attention of someone conducting a thorough audit. She touched his face with one finger. She looked at Charlotte. She looked at Frederick. She made a sound that was not quite a word but conveyed provisional acceptance. "She approves," Cormac said from the doorway with confidence. "She is thinking about it," Charlotte said. "She approves," Cormac repeated. He had known Rose since she was 6 weeks old, and he was not without expertise. Rose did approve. Within a week she had developed a proprietary interest in James that expressed itself as bringing him things, her own toys, pieces of bread, once an entire apple, and monitoring whoever was holding him with the focused scrutiny of someone who has decided they are personally responsible for a thing's welfare. James received all of this with the benign equanimity of a very young baby who does not yet understand what a sister is, but has no objection to the concept. Frederick watched all of this from various vantage points of the house and the ranch and the porch, and what he felt was not something he was always able to put into words, but it was complete. It was the feeling of a thing being whole. The adoption approval for Rose came through in July, delivered by a courier from Denver, a legal document with a judge's signature and the seal of the state of Colorado, and Charlotte held it at the kitchen table and read it 3 times, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the cedar box where she kept important papers, and then she found Frederick in the barn and she said, "It is official." He set down the harness he was cleaning and looked at her, at the quiet on her face that was happiness too deep for expression. "It was official the day she smiled at you," he said. Charlotte crossed the barn and put her arms around him, which she had done many times since March of 1883, but this time it had its own particular quality, the holding of something hard-won and absolutely real. He held her back, and the horses were quiet in their stalls, and outside the barn the summer world went on in its large and indifferent way, and inside it the two of them were entirely sufficient. The following years were not without their difficulties, because years never are. There was a bad drought in the summer of 1885 that tested the pasture and the cattle and the family's reserves, and required careful management and some hard decisions. Frederick handled it with the steady pragmatism that was his nature, and Charlotte handled it with the organizational efficiency that was hers, and between them they got through it without serious loss, which many of their neighboring ranchers could not say. There were also the ordinary griefs. A calf lost in the spring storm of 1886, which upset Rose considerably. A winter fever that went through the household in early 1887 and laid Frederick flat for 10 days, during which Charlotte ran the ranch with William's help and Cormac's, and a professionalism that impressed everyone including Frederick, when he was well enough to take stock of what had been managed in his absence. And there was the smaller event of a letter arriving in November 1886 from a law office in Missouri, informing Charlotte that Douglas Beale had died of a mining accident in New Mexico in September, which closed the last remaining open question about Rose's origins in a way that was not dramatic but was final. Charlotte read the letter and set it down and looked at Rose, who was 4 years old now and running through the kitchen with a rag doll and a very clear sense of her own importance in the universe, and Charlotte said quietly to Frederick, "She will want to know someday about Irene." "We will tell her," Frederick said, "when she is ready, all of it. Her mother was your best friend and she was loved." "Yes," Charlotte said, "she was. And Rose is loved," he said. "Enormously," Charlotte said, "by everyone who has the good fortune of knowing her." Rose stopped in the middle of the kitchen with her rag doll and looked at both of them with the particular suspicion of a child who suspects she is being talked about. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Charlotte said with great innocence. "That face you make means something," Rose said, with the accuracy of a child who has been paying close attention for 4 years. Frederick laughed. Charlotte laughed. Rose looked pleased at having produced this effect and went back to running. In the spring of 1887, Charlotte found herself expecting again, which she announced to Frederick over breakfast with the same calm steadiness she brought to significant information, and Frederick's response was to put down his fork and look at her for a long moment and say, "Are you well?" which was always his first question, because he had never lost the habit of wanting to know about her before anything else. "I am very well," she said, as she had said before. "Good," he said. And then, because Rose was listening from across the table with enormous interest and James was in his chair distributing porridge in ways that were optimistic about gravity. Frederick kept his larger response for the evening, when the children were in bed, and they were on the porch together in the spring air, and he said then what he had been carrying since breakfast, which was that he was grateful every single day for the specific accident of her arrival on his road and the specific decision he had made to open that door. "It was not an accident," Charlotte said. "No," he said. "I chose your road," she said. "Mrs. Caldwell's letter said there was a ranch 8 miles east of Creston and I could ask there for directions. I chose to walk. I chose to go to the door." "You could have walked past," he said. "I could have," she said. "I nearly did." A small pause in which the spring night moved around them and the stars were doing what Colorado stars do, which is be absolutely uncompromising about their own magnificence. "I almost talked myself into going past. I told myself it was an imposition and I should find my own way and not trouble a stranger." "I am glad you didn't listen to yourself," he said. "I am glad you opened the door," she said. He took her hand, the way he had taken it 100 times, the way he intended to take it for the rest of his life, and held it. "I will always open the door," he said. The second baby was a girl, born in December of 1887 in a snowstorm that kept Dr. Marsh from making it to the ranch in time. And so she was delivered by Cormac, who had assisted at more than one difficult birth in his years on the frontier, and who managed the situation with a calmness that Frederick was deeply grateful for, being somewhat less calm himself. Charlotte was characteristically steady throughout, which Frederick found both admirable and somewhat humbling, and the baby arrived healthy and loud, announcing herself with an opinion about the cold that could be heard in the barn. They named her Margaret Irene Slater. Margaret for Frederick's mother, who had died before he bought the ranch but who had been a woman of considerable character, and Irene for Charlotte's friend, for Rose's mother, for the woman whose love for a child had set everything in motion. When Charlotte said the name for the first time, Margaret Irene, there was something in her face that was private and specific, a grief and a gratitude both at once, and Frederick held both her and the baby and did not try to make it anything other than what it was. Rose, 5 years old, was introduced to her sister the following morning and informed the household that the baby's name was good and that she personally would take responsibility for making sure Margaret was appropriately educated. James, 3 years old, was less certain about the whole enterprise but warmed to it within a week, as was his nature with most things. William Keating had, by this time, become a permanent fixture of the ranch in every practical sense, a young man of 23 who had grown into the work and the land with a wholeness that his sister recognized and his brother-in-law respected. He had also, in the spring of 1887, begun courting a young woman from Creston named Eliza Partridge, who was 21 and the daughter of the blacksmith and who had, Charlotte told Frederick privately, very good sense and an excellent laugh, and was clearly just as fond of William as he was of her. William married Eliza in Creston in the fall of 1888, in the same Presbyterian church where Charlotte and Frederick had been married 5 years before, and Frederick stood as his witness, and Charlotte sat in the front pew with Margaret on her lap, and Rose beside her vibrating with the excitement of anyone who loves a wedding, and James on her other side doing his best to sit still, which was a project he found demanding. After the ceremony, outside the church in the October light, with the whole of Creston in a good mood and Joseph Carver somewhere nearby with his fiddle, Cormac stood next to Frederick and looked at the assembled company, the newlyweds, Charlotte with the children around her, Thomas Keating who had come from Missouri for the wedding, and was talking to someone with the dignified pleasure of a man who has seen his family come right, and Cormac said, with the simplicity of a man who means everything he says, "You done good, Frederick Slater." Frederick looked at it all, at Charlotte catching his eye across the yard and smiling, at Rose already dancing to the fiddle with her grandfather, at James eating someone's wedding cake with a focus that was entirely his own, at Margaret asleep in the carrier against Charlotte's chest, and he said, "I opened a door." "No," Cormac said. "More than that." Frederick considered this. "She walked up the road," he said. "More than that too," Cormac said. "You saw her coming and you didn't step back from it." "A lot of men would have stepped back." "I did step back," Frederick said. "You stepped back to make room," Cormac said. "That's the difference." Frederick stood in the Colorado October with the whole of the life he had and the whole of the life still ahead of it, and he thought about a road and a dust cloud, and a woman coming toward him in the afternoon light, and the moment of stepping back, not away, not in retreat, but back to make room, to open space, to say with a gesture what became true in every year that followed it. "You are welcome here, both of you. Come in out of whatever the world has put you through. Come in and be warm, come in and stay." "Come on," Charlotte said, arriving at his elbow with Margaret still asleep against her chest and a piece of wedding cake in each hand, one of which she gave to him with her small smile. "Your brother-in-law wants to dance." Frederick took the cake. "I am not a very good dancer," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you are willing, and that counts for something." He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked back toward the music, toward the family and the friends and the October light and the ongoing, ordinary, extraordinary life of Slater's Crossing. And Rose came spinning out of the dancers to grab her father's hand and drag him in. And James decided the cake was finished and joined his sister. And Margaret woke up and blinked at the world with dark-eyed attention. And Charlotte stood in the middle of it all and felt the fullness of it. The specific weight of a life that had been built from a choice made on a dusty road in September 1882, the choice to walk toward a door and hope it opened. It had opened. It had stayed open. It would, she knew with the certainty that comes not from hope, but from evidence, stay open for the rest of their lives. And Cormac, standing at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands and his Sunday expression, looked at Frederick dancing badly and Charlotte laughing at him, and Rose leading James in a circle and the baby regarding the world from Charlotte's arms. And he felt, as he had felt on the night Frederick rode through the dark for a doctor, and on the morning Charlotte walked back up the road, and on the April day when two people said their promises in a small church with 32 witnesses. The presence of something larger than any of them, something that used roads and dust, and the small braveries of ordinary people to make itself known. He said a quiet word of thanks to it. Then he went and got himself a piece of wedding cake, because it had been a very good day. Over the years that followed, Slater's Crossing grew in ways that were measured and real. The ranch expanded 40 acres in 1890 when the neighboring parcel came available, and Frederick and William managed the expanded operation together with the kind of working partnership that is built on mutual respect and honest labor. The cattle herd grew to respectable size. The house was added to at the back to make room for the family that was filling it, and the garden that Charlotte had taken from haphazard to purposeful became, in her hands, a genuine source of beauty and provision. Rose grew up to be exactly who she had always been in miniature, certain, capable, curious about everything, with her mother Irene's brightness in her face and something of Charlotte's steadiness in her manner. When she was old enough to understand it, Charlotte sat with her and told her about Irene, not as a tragedy but as a person, describing the laugh and the apple preserves and the terrible mathematics and the enormous love that had brought Irene to Colorado and brought Rose into the world. Rose had listened with the full attention she brought to everything, and at the end she had sat for a moment and then said, "She sounds like she was wonderful." "She was," Charlotte said, "and you are very like her in some ways. And I think she would have been so proud of who you are." Rose had nodded slowly, absorbing this, and then she had looked at Charlotte with those dark eyes and said, "And you came for me." "I came for you," Charlotte said. "Because she was your friend," Rose said. "Because she was my friend," Charlotte said. "And because you were hers, and because you needed someone and I was the one who knew." Rose had leaned against Charlotte's arm and Charlotte had held her, and there had been nothing more that needed saying. James grew into a boy, and then a young man of excellent practical sense, and a gift for mathematics that Thomas Keating, when he visited, as he did every other year until his passing in 1893, which was peaceful and at home in Missouri with Charlotte's brother at his side, declared with satisfaction to be clear evidence of inherited schoolteacher quality. James was the kind of person who solved problems quietly, who observed situations before entering them, who had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness in a particular combination that made him easy to trust. Margaret grew up knowing both her names and why she had them. She had Irene's name because a woman deserved to be remembered, Charlotte told her, and because sometimes the best way to honor a person is to say their name into the future. Margaret treated this responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. She was also, of all the children, the most like Charlotte in temperament, capable and observant and profoundly generous, with an eye for what needed doing and a habit of doing it before it was asked. Cormac Reedy stayed at Slater's Crossing until 1895, when his health began to require more ease than ranch work allowed, and Frederick arranged for him to move to a small house in Creston, where Cormac's niece could look after him. The arrangement was made with complete honesty and complete affection, and Cormac accepted it with the grace of a man who knows when something good is complete. He lived well in Creston, attended his church with dedication, and visited the ranch for Sunday suppers with a frequency that suited everyone. He died in the winter of 1897, quietly and without drama, and was buried in the Creston churchyard, and the whole family came for the service, Frederick and Charlotte, Rose and James and Margaret, William and Eliza and their 2 children, and the church was full, because Cormac had 50 years of making bread and telling the truth and showing up for people, and that adds up to more than most people expect. After the service, Charlotte and Frederick walked through Creston in the winter afternoon, their breath making small clouds, their hands together, and they did not talk much, only walked, and the town was quiet around them, and they were both thinking about a man who had gone to make up a spare room for a woman he had never met and a baby he had never seen, because it was the right thing to do, and who had spent 15 years of Sundays and suppers and daily presences being part of something he had helped make possible. He would say it was nothing, Charlotte said. He would say he only made up a room, Frederick agreed. Making room is not nothing, she said. He looked at her. No, he said, it is the whole thing. She looked at him back, and the winter light was pale and clear, and they had been together 12 years, and the love between them was nothing like the careful tentative thing of letters and first evenings. It was the deep daily permanent kind that you build from being honest with each other through all the ordinary hours, the kind that does not require announcement because it is present in everything, in the way he brought her coffee, and she knew without asking how he took his, in the way she said his name, and he heard everything, in the way they had built something real on a foundation that had started with a step back and a door opened. Come on, he said, the children will be waiting. She tightened her hand in his and they walked together through the Colorado winter toward home. Slater's Crossing endured, the land held, the family grew. Rose married a good man named Nathan Holt in 1901, a surveyor who had come to the county to map the new roads and who had met Rose at the general store and been permanently altered by the experience, which Frederick found he could not fault a man for. Rose and Nathan built a house 2 miles from the ranch, close enough for Sunday dinners and far enough for their own life, which is exactly the right distance. James studied engineering in Denver, the first of the Slater children to leave for formal education, and came back afterward because Colorado was his, and the family was his, and some things you do not leave even when you love the wider world. He took on more of the ranch management as Frederick got older, not replacing him but beside him, learning the way you learn from someone you love, with attention and humility and the particular quality of time that is not hurried. Margaret became a teacher. She opened a school in Creston in 1903, in a small building that the town helped build, and taught the children of ranchers and miners and shopkeepers with the thoroughness of her grandfather Thomas and the warmth of her own particular nature. And she was the kind of teacher that children remember their whole lives, which is the only kind worth being. In the summer of 1905, Frederick and Charlotte sat on the porch of the house they had expanded twice in 22 years, and the evening was warm, and the ranch was quiet in the way that active things are quiet when the day's work is done. Frederick was 54 and had the look of a man who has spent 30 years in the weather and the work, solid and a little slower than he had been, but fundamentally and completely himself. Charlotte was 50, and she had the look of a woman who had lived a full life with intention, and it suited her the way everything she did suited her, fully and without apology. "Rose is coming Sunday," Charlotte said, "with the children." "I know," he said. She wrote. "James has the Delaney contract sorted," she said. "He told me this morning." "Good," he said. "And Margaret's school has 12 new pupils this term," she said. "Good," he said again. She was quiet for a moment. He was quiet. The evening moved around them, and the creek was audible from here on still nights, and the cattle were settled, and the horses in the paddock stood easy, and everything was, in the simplest and truest sense, all right. "Do you remember," Charlotte said, "when I walked up this road?" He looked at the road. 30 years had smoothed it and widened it. The buckboard going in and out had made it a real road rather than a suggestion of one. But it was the same road, the same bend where she had first appeared to him in the September afternoon, 22 years ago, carrying another woman's baby and no explanation. "I remember," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I had not told you that before. I was absolutely terrified." He looked at her. "You didn't look it." "I could not afford to look it," she said. "I had Rose, and I had $43, and I had no plan past the next hour, and I was walking up a strange man's road in Colorado, and I had no idea what I would find." She paused. "I had hoped for directions. I had hoped for perhaps a drink of water. I had not hoped for this." She gestured not at anything specific, but at everything. At the ranch and the house and the evening and him. "What did you hope for?" he asked quietly. "I hoped you would not turn us away," she said. "That was the full extent of my hope. Just don't turn us away." He thought about the moment she had appeared on that road in the low September sun, her silhouette carrying that small bundle, moving with purpose toward his door. He thought about what he had felt, not alarm, not calculation, not the weighing of inconvenience. Just the simple clear recognition of someone who needed a door opened. That was all. That was the whole of it. "I would never have turned you away," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it then." "You took the chance anyway," he said. "Yes," she said, "I took the chance." He reached over and took her hand, the hand that wore the simple silver ring, and held it the way he had held it for 22 years, and she held his back, and they sat in the evening of their life together, which was not simple and not without cost and not anything that could have been predicted from the moment of its beginning, but was theirs, completely and irreversibly theirs, built from a step backward and a door opened, and two people who had chosen, over and over in every ordinary hour. The true thing over the sensible one. The stars came out. The ranch settled into the dark. Somewhere inside the house a lamp was lit, and the light made the window warm, and it would be warm all night. And in the morning Charlotte would make coffee and Frederick would be up before her and have it ready. And the day would begin the way it always began, with the particular ordinary grace of a life that has been, from one September afternoon in 1882 to now, and onward into every future the two of them had left, abundantly and stubbornly and gratefully alive.